Good morning, afternoon, or evening to you all in your homes or offices. I'm Kaine Ezell, and I'm an associate professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University, where I teach courses in composition, American literature, and English education. I first want to express my gratitude to the Center for Mark Twain Studies at Elmira College for the opportunity to present my work to Mark Twain scholars and enthusiasts. I consider myself an interloper in the field of Mark Twain studies, and any time I've presented my work to you all, I've greatly appreciated your cordiality, even if you disagree with said work. As an interloper, I also want to express admiration for the work that scholars have done with primary historical text and learning more about Mark Twain and his world. As a person whose primary field is contemporary popular culture, I stand on your shoulders and the knowledge you've cultivated. Whether I am researching the humor and satire in animated television programs or YouTubers and the context in which they exist in American culture, I find that many of my research roads lead to Mark Twain, and I'm honored to try out some of my ideas on you all in this lecture. There is a certain irony in my presentation that I didn't anticipate. When I agreed to present this work, it was in the before times in January of 2020, and I envisioned presenting this work to you all in a lecture hall. However, because of the pandemic and the development of modern technology, many of you may be watching this video on the medium that is a major focus of my lecture, YouTube. Though I have an infinite interest in the critical entertainment offered by YouTubers, I have had no intention of trying to become one myself. The irony of my presentation being moved to a virtual space and posted to YouTube is not lost on me. It is my hope that if this somehow ends up going viral, it will be for good reasons. So my larger project right now that I've been working on over the past year or so involves an analysis of the humor and or satire and criticism and how it functions in American culture. It was originally inspired by a combination of procrastination and Voltaire. You see, when I'm trying to avoid the work I should be doing, I tend to watch YouTube. Because I like to keep up with popular culture and humor, I tend to watch reviews of movies and TV shows, both current and older movies and TV shows. Began to observe that many, if not all, of the channels that I watch employ sophisticated evaluations of text and combined with humor. So naturally, I made that my work. And now I'm procrastinating analyzing YouTube videos with other things that I'll eventually turn into research. But that's a research project for another time. The large amount of YouTube review channels illustrates that one need not have credentials or be employed by a publication to record an opinion and post it for all to see. While there are a number of these reviews that go unseen on YouTube, many end up accumulating millions of views, and the channels that they air on accumulate millions of subscribers, some as many as 10 million. Most of these channels employ humor as a pivotal strategy in their reviews because audiences find enjoyment in the mocking of a work of art, even if it is a work of commercial art intended for large audiences. So what pleasure do audiences receive from seeing a work of art mocked for laughs? Of course, terms such as criticism and humor in the context that I'm using them are broad, and one can trace humorous jokes and comments and criticism all the way back to Aristotle. So, for the time being, allow me to redefine or define my terms more clearly. By criticism and review, I am referring to an organized, coherent, and developed aesthetic evaluation of a work of art, whether that art be art, music, film, novels, television. Of course, academic and professional critics are still squabbling about the extent to which evaluation or gatekeeping should play a role in criticism. But I am taking my definition from Noel Carroll's definition offered in On Criticism, in which he says that criticism is essentially evaluation grounded in reasons. In the reviews by Mark Twain and Red Letter Media, they are both performing an aesthetic evaluation of a text and offering a final judgment based upon reasoned analysis. My definition here excludes riffing, such as one may see in Mystery Science Theater 3000, because riffing does not usually propose a central sustained evaluation. One can riff on a good work or a bad work of art without proposing any clear conclusion about its function or success in achieving its artistic goals. By humor and satire, I'm relegating my definition to the sustained use of humor and satire in a critical review. In other words, in addition to evaluation, comedy, humor, and/or satire should be a primary vehicle in communicating aesthetic judgments. I find it necessary to narrow these terms in particular because if I didn't narrow it, I would be searching for one-liners from American critics such as Poe, Twain, Plinkett, Vonnegut, Siskel, and Ebert, and numerous other critics who employ humor in their reviews, but are not seeking humor as a primary function in their criticism. One can find ample examples of jokes and humor in At the Movies, but no one would make the argument that humor is the main goal of the show. I'm interested in work that balances the evaluative and the humorous. Those reviews with something clear to say about a work of art, and that use humor as a primary means of expressing their evaluations. In addition to procrastination, Voltaire's Candide, which doesn't even meet my criteria, partially inspired this project. In Candide, the title character and his unfortunate crew visit the garden of a noble Venetian, Pococurante, in chapter 25. Candide marvels at Pococurante's vast collection of art, literature, and music. However, his host is not quite as enthused over his own collection. On the contrary, it bores him. When Candide asks Pococurante about the works of literary giants from Homer to Milton, he cannot muster any excitement and proceeds to criticize each of the works that Candide praises. On Homer, he asserts, "They used at one time to make me believe that I took a pleasure in reading him, but that continual repetition of battles, so extremely like one another, those gods that are always active without doing anything decisive, that Helen who is the cause of the war, and who yet scarcely appears in the peace, that Troy, so long besieged without being taken, all these together caused me great weariness." He goes on to say that those who have been honest with them have said that Homer makes them go to sleep. He says worse about Milton. He calls Milton a barbarian who writes a long commentary in 10 books of harsh verse on the first chapter of Genesis. That slovenly imitator of the Greeks who disfigures the creation by making the Messiah take a pair of compasses from heaven's armory to plan the world, whereas Moses represents the deity as producing the whole universe by his fiat. Can I think you have any esteem for a writer who has spoiled Tasso's hell and the devil, who transforms Lucifer sometimes into a toad and at others into a pygmy, and who makes him say the same thing over and over again 100 times? Who metamorphoses him into a school divine, and who, by an absurdly serious imitation of Ariosto's comic invention of firearms, represents the devils and angels cannonading each other in heaven? As is common with the characters he encounters in the novel, Candide becomes smitten with Pococurante's hipster nonchalance, proclaiming, "What a noble genius is this Pococurante! Nothing can please him," fully anticipating the advent of YouTube criticism. Of course, a judicious reader eventually learns that, as his name suggests, Pococurante's detachment and his insults of Homer, Raphael, Virgil, Cicero, and others are Voltaire's way of criticizing the detached and apathetic wealthy of his own time. Be that as it may, one can argue that there is also a sort of perverse pleasure that Voltaire takes in criticizing these writers. I teach a class that emphasizes most of the works that Pococurante blasts, and of all the sections in Candide, this was one of the sections that resonates most with students, I presume because they perceive an element of truth in Voltaire's critiques. This mode of criticism is also evident in YouTube videos, but the target is clearly different. The humorous critiques offered by YouTubers are often not meant to provide commentary on the disaffected audiences that read them. Instead, they are ways of leveling works, a way to show that no work is perfect, and most works, even works that are considered pure works of art, are extremely flawed. I began to wonder if this mode of criticism offered in YouTube videos is a novel development in American culture. So I traced this development backward And in my tracing of this development backward, I rediscovered Mark Twain's Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses, which is among the works that perfects the synthesis of humor and criticism as a means of leveling what have been perceived to be great works of art. My talk will explore the influence of Mark Twain's famous roasting of James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales and its unspoken influence on contemporary film criticism found in comedic video essays on social media. Using parody and satire, Twain vents his rage at Cooper's fiction and does much to convince his readers of Cooper's crimes against literature. The essay has had a remarkable staying power in American anthologies, even after multiple critics have dutifully and successfully revealed Twain's manipulations and exaggerations of Cooper's texts to arrive at his conclusions. Nevertheless, the reception to Cooper's novels has been forever altered by Mark Twain's criticisms. Many YouTube channels that provide satirical commentary on popular culture fulfill a similar function for the early 21st century. But among the best examples of Twain's combination of humor and satire are the so-called Plinkett Reviews on Red Letter Media, particularly in their reviews of Star Wars films. Both Twain and Red Letter Media serve as clear examples of the use of humor in critical review of fiction that seeks to make broader arguments about how criticism can influence the sensibilities of consumers in American culture. It is my argument that part of Twain's mission in his attack on Cooper is indicative of a need to deflate what has become needlessly romanticized in the eyes of critics and scholars, and a humorous takedown of a target often leaves a lasting impression. Through a satire on the art and the artists that produce it, an emphasis on the language and grammar of a medium while establishing an artistic ideal, and anti-criticism against those who attempt to advocate for bad art. Both of these reviews attempt and to varying degrees succeed in illustrating the democratization of criticism of art in American culture. As I introduce these works, I would also like to discuss the growing democratization of criticism that Mark Twain helps to shape. To state the obvious, the internet has changed some things, including criticism. The growth of user interaction in the era of Web 2.0 has resulted in an army of critics waiting to pounce on the last movie, album, or even a review of an album or a movie. We have undoubtedly reached the zenith of the democratization of criticism in American culture. No longer does one need to be credentialed or formally educated. All one needs is a camera, a ring light, a YouTube account, and an opinion, and then one can criticize. Greg Taylor suggests that the growth of PostVanguard Criticism, which took its greatest shape in the 1960s, can have a benefit for scholars. Scholars of culture and media might thus do well to consider more closely the various forms and functions of this larger economy and indeed embrace their place in it. For indeed, the academic's own expert, super compartmentalized analytical assessment of works is nothing to be ashamed of, however effaced or disavowed it may have been in the past. The question, finally, is not whether scholars judge cultural objects like everyone else. Of course we do, but rather how and to what ends. Certainly, Taylor is correct that academics, especially those who study popular culture, need to avoid establishing a hierarchical relationship to those who critique movies on a YouTube channel or on Rotten Tomatoes or on IMDb. Rather, they must understand the divergent goals involved in the kind of review taking place. After all, the assertion of the everyman critic against the scholarly, elitist arbiters of good taste began in the 19th century with Mark Twain. Mark Twain played a large role in this assertion when he published Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses in the North American Review in 1895. The essay makes a comprehensive list of Cooper's artistic failings, from his use of implausible logic in his plots to his use of language and grammar. He ultimately concludes that Cooper's Deerslayer is not a work of art in any sense. It does seem to me that it is destitute of every detail that goes into the making of a work of art. In truth, it seems to me that Deerslayer is just simply a delirium tremens. Ouch. What is noteworthy in this context is that the framing of Twain's critique is a response to a Professor Lounsbury, who is a professor of English literature at Yale. He claimed that the Deerslayer and the Pioneers are pure works of art, did Lounsbury. And Twain provides Lounsbury's wider praise of Cooper in the epigraph before the beginning of the essay. In addition to Lounsbury, Twain includes epigraphs from a Professor Brander Matthews, a professor at Columbia and a friend of Twain's, and English novelist Wilkie Collins. Twain also takes shots at their praise for Cooper in the essay. The grouping of such acclaimed scholars certainly intimates that he is in large part attempting to undermine the idea of literary expertise and scholarship. He makes it even more plain in the first paragraph of the essay. It seems to me that it was far from right for these men to deliver opinions on Cooper without having read some of it. It would have been much more decorous to keep silent and let persons talk who have read Cooper. The sentence is a less than subtle insinuation that academic elitist critics spend so much time pontificating on high concepts that they entirely miss the underlying faults in a work of literature, as a regular person may read it. Bernard DeVoto notes that Mark Twain in unpublished manuscripts intended for there to be a sequel to Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses, which would have begun a series of reviews by a persona called Mark Twain, M.A., professor of Belles Lettres in the Veterinary College of Arizona. Though the series never came to fruition, that Twain conceptualized the idea illustrates a desire to include his voice as a critic beyond the commentary he offered in private letters or embedded in his fiction and essays. What Twain does offer in his other writings is an attempt to evaluate literature outside of the established arbiters of good taste. Sidney Krause even notes that Twain was liberated from hidebound ideas and had an aptitude for lighting on the essential. So, Mark Twain's main mission in literary criticism and in conveying his ideas of literature, not only in private, but using his public persona, is that of a person who is trying to translate literature for an every person. So while he certainly wanted his work to be appreciated, while Mark Twain wanted his work to be appreciated within the sphere of the educated and the elite, he also fashioned himself in his writing as a man of the people in his approaches to literature. On his own writing, he claims, "My books are water. Those of the great geniuses are wine. Everybody drinks water." In A Tramp Abroad, Twain does more to differentiate his appeal to popularity in regard to taste and criticism. Of music, he writes, "I suppose there are two kinds of music, one kind which one feels, just as an oyster might, and another sort which requires a higher faculty which must be assisted and developed by teaching. Yet, if bass music gives certain of us wings, why should we want any other? But we do. We want it because the higher and better like it. We want it without giving it the necessary time and trouble. So we climb into that upper tier in that dress circle by a lie. We pretend to like it. I know several of that sort of people, and I propose to be one of them myself when I get home with my fine European education." So in this quotation is a certain echo of Voltaire's Poco Credante, except Mark Twain is not mocking the idea of pretending to like high art, right? That we are trained to believe that the elites give us our view of what good art is, and we pretend to like it even if we don't understand it, and even if we do understand it and don't like it. So this passage illustrates the propensity of higher social circles to elevate art that requires higher faculty and dismiss the base forms of artistic expression. Twain is also exposing the pretense of consumers who ignore their own feelings of a work and take the view of an acceptable critic. The section on music is followed by a discussion of J.M.W. Turner's The Slave Ship. Before reading Ruskin's praise of the piece, the narrator is prepared to agree with the newspaper reporter's assessment that the painting reminded him of a tortoise-shell cat having a fit in a platter of tomatoes. However, after seeing Ruskin's more educated view, the narrator is forced to agree, or at least pretend to agree, that the slave ship is a great work of art. Of course, he goes on to say that after seeing most of Turner's other work, the pieces he appreciated most did not at all remind him of the slave ship, leaving some doubt in his full conversion to Ruskin's view. This discussion of art and music in A Tramp Abroad does much to prefigure Twain's stance on Cooper, because we see a clear divide between criticism as reflected by the so-called arbiters of good taste and criticism as reflected by someone who wants to hear a good story and for the story to make sense. Mark Twain's view would go on to have profound effects on criticism because it validates the readings of those who are not professors at Yale or Columbia, or those who are not hired to write for magazines or newspapers. In this view, anyone can be a critic. Fast forward a century later, and the internet has provided the ability for anyone to publish criticism online. With the advent of YouTube, one of the most popular genres for film criticism is the video essay. Because the algorithms for viewer preferences are so efficient, if you watch one video essay reviewing a Star Wars movie, chances are your recommended watch list will be flooded with dozens of critics opining on the latest Star Wars movies. So, to use Twain's metaphor, in the span of 100 plus years, we have gone from Mark Twain carving a space for water over wine to a market flooded with water. Red Letter Media has benefited from this development, but as its reviews of the Star Wars films indicate, they are also wary of the implications of the complete democratization of criticism. Red Letter Media is a video production company that also operates a YouTube channel. The major contributors to the channel are Mike Stoklasa, Jay Bauman, and Rich Evans, though an array of others rotate into their shows. The company produces its own films, but it is perhaps best known for its array of reviews of popular culture in a variety of formats. They appeared on the national scene with a series of comedic reviews published in 2009 and 2010 of the Star Wars prequels through a persona named Harry S. Plinkett. Though Plinkett is depicted in their other programs by Rich Evans, Mike Stoklasa provides the voice of Plinkett in the video essays, and Plinkett's face does not appear in the reviews, only the rest of his bodies and cutaways of him baking pizza rolls in the oven, or putting in a tape, or searching for things in his basement where he keeps people captive. Though the Plinkett character is credited with writing and producing the content, Stoklasa is the primary writer, producer, and editor. The reviews are meant to vocalize Stoklasa's disappointments in the Star Wars prequel trilogy, released in 1999, 2002, and 2005. Rather than present the video essays in his own voice with a serious tone, Stoklasa employs the Plinkett character to establish a comedic tone. In short, Plinkett is an elderly, polio-stricken, murderous psychopath from New Jersey who preys on women and also loves to make reviews of movies. He is a satirical parody of the Buffalo Bill character in Silence of the Lambs. In his movie reviews, he juxtaposes his reviews of films focusing on plot structures, characters, and visual framing with revelations about the murders of his wives, his addictions, and his kidnapping and torture of women. Much like the persona that Twain develops as a professor of belles lettres at the Veterinary College of Arizona, the Plinkett character is an interesting method of delivery for Stoklasa's criticisms of film, because there is no reason for the audience to take anything he says seriously. Yet the audience is asked to agree with a murderous maniac that the Star Wars prequel films are indeed bad. At this time in the presentation, I would like to give you a break from hearing my voice and invite you to watch the following two clips from Plinkett Reviews. The clip on the left, which you will not be able to follow the link if you're watching this on YouTube, But if you can type in the link and watch the time codes 1 hour, 13 minutes and 45 seconds to 1 hour, 26 minutes and 25 seconds, and follow that with the link on the right, type it in, and then watch time codes 10 minutes and 56 seconds to 14 minutes and 50 seconds. That will help give you some context first into what the Plinkett reviews look like and sound like. And also, I'll be referring to these segments as I continue my presentation. So pause what you're watching now and type in these links and watch these clips, and I will be here waiting after you press the pause button. And also be aware that the clips might contain language and scenarios that are slightly disturbing. Again, the character of Plinkett is a murderous psychopath who reviews movies as well. So keep that in mind as you watch the reviews. Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for returning. For the remainder of this presentation, I would like to focus on 3 particular strategies that Mark Twain and Plinkett use in their reviews. The first strategy is the use of a comic mask in order to perform a satire of the text itself and also the artist who produces the text. The second strategy used by both is the implication in this satire of an artistic ideal in opposition to the text. And the third strategy is what I call anti-criticism and deconstruction of academic criticism in order to protect from the kind of pedantic analysis that Mark Twain and Plinkett criticize in their own reviews. Mark Twain's and Harry Plinkett's critiques are propelled by the use of the comic mask. In Mark Twain as Critic, Sidney Krause argues that Twain's public criticism was mainly mediated by masks, as was much else that he published, and by their use he obtained a well-nigh perfect scheme for himself. The mask also proves useful in the Plinkett reviews because it allows Stoklasa to criticize George Lucas and the Star Wars prequels. And Plinkett, though through his obsessive attention to detail, serves as a frustrated avatar of people who were disappointed by the Star Wars prequels. Indeed, Benjamin Kerbach writes, Plinkett can embody this kind of fanboy hyperbole since he is as much produced by the films he reviews as the reviews produced by him. The Plinkett shtick is thus revealed as a collapsed or inverted narrative frame. Stoklasa constructs a fictional critic. It is in this sense that Plinkett can body forth a kind of catharsis. He legitimates our nerd rage by literalizing it. The mask also allows for hyperbole, which then allows for greater attack on the text and artist. The attacks on the text and the artist imply a greater application of art, usually in a more formal style. The mask also serves as a sort of self-defense. Though he thrived on a reputation as a sharp-witted satirist, Twain was not always comfortable criticizing the work of others. Even after his assault on Cooper's fiction, Twain relented in a private letter to friend Joseph Twitchell. Nancy Baranow notes that Twain expressed regret specifically regarding his treatment of Brander Matthews. Nevertheless, he let the critique of Cooper and the critics who praise him stand publicly. The public persona he crafts for his review of Cooper allows him to freely exaggerate and distort in order to make his larger point. Krause argues that Twain leads his reader in a wonderland of Cooper's fiction, and the trick that Twain plays by oscillating between deference and caustic attack results in Twain's analysis of Cooper being absorbed by many American literature scholars, and even Cooper scholars like Brander Matthews. Indeed, despite Krause's defenses of Cooper's work against Twain's assaults, he even admits that so much of it is preponderantly and basically, if not always specifically, true. The mask is used to convey criticisms that, while humorous, are also meant to be taken seriously. So what are the criticisms offered by Mark Twain and Harry Plinkett? Well, for Mark Twain and his critique of James Fenimore Cooper, the short answer is everything. Mark Twain establishes 19 rules governing literary art in the domain of romantic fiction, and Cooper, in Twain's estimation, violates 18 of them. But what does that mean specifically? More specifically, Twain is asserting that Cooper fails on a plot level in how he establishes characters, and he also fails in his plot devices. The best example of this critique being Cooper's use of what Mark Twain calls his little box of stage properties. And the best example of the stage property that Mark Twain homes in on is the broken twig, right, in which Mark Twain claims that anytime a Cooper character or a collection of Cooper characters need to be completely silent, someone is going to step on a broken twig. And Mark Twain even exaggerates this criticism to say, even if there are no twigs around, a Cooper character will go out and find a twig and bring it back so that someone can step on it and alert everyone to their presence. That Mark Twain accuses Cooper of going to the well of these little box of stage properties time and time again, and he relies on them too much. In the same vein, he also has an over-reliance on miracles, and Twain exemplifies this in a target shooting contest with Leatherstocking, Pathfinder, Natty Bumppo, in which they are shooting at a target from 100 yards away. Yet Leatherstocking can not only see the target clearly, but he can also shoot on top of two other bullets and have his bullet not touch the sides of where the previous bullets had entered the target. And Mark Twain finds this to be stretching the willing suspension of disbelief. Other elements that Mark Twain critiques are Cooper's inconsistent dialogue and his poor word choice. And in his inconsistent dialogue, he uses Natty Bumppo as an example, where in one passage he'll talk like a Harvard professor, and in another passage he'll talk like a country bumpkin. And there's no consistency in how Natty Bumppo talks. And then there's finally the matter of Cooper's style, his poor word choice. And in Mark Twain's writing of the essay, each of these errors, or each of these problems, each of these offenses compound upon one another to the point where Mark Twain ultimately concludes that it does seem to me that Deerslayer is not a work of art in any sense. In truth, it is just simply a literary delirium tremens. So in a similar way, Harry Plinkett constructs a list of compounding problems with the Star Wars prequels. And more specifically, Plinkett says, what's wrong with this movie? Everything. Each review of each of the 3 Star Wars prequels, at some point Plinkett says, well, what's wrong with this movie? In short, everything. But Plinkett also points to some specific problems that keep the prequels from being good movies. And the first and biggest problem that Plinkett identifies is the lack of a clear, relatable protagonist. In his review of episode 1, he says that there is no protagonist, that we might be meant to follow the story of Anakin Skywalker, but in that movie, Anakin Skywalker is a child and therefore unaware of the events that's happening around him. In the second movie, there are 2 main characters, neither of whom are very relatable. And then by the third movie, as you saw in the clip, one of the clips that I recommended for you, that we have a trilogy of movies that are meant to be a character study, yet the character that Lucas developed over the 3 movies is not likable and he's not relatable. And the problems compound from there, right? So you have first a character problem, and then you have a plot problem. And then finally you get into Plinkett's critique of Lucas as an unimaginative writer and director, and his unimaginative blocking and editing and framing of shots. And then finally, a criticism of this over-reliance on computer-generated special effects. And Plinkett's conclusion toward the end of the episode 3 review is that episode 3 isn't art, it's commercial diarrhea. I didn't know it possible to have a harsher conclusion, than Twain's conclusion of James Fenimore Cooper, but I think Plinkett might have clinched it, as Natty Bumppo might say. What strikes one about the tones of both Twain and Plinkett in these reviews is not only their complete raising of the text itself, but also a personal attack on the artist. Of course, it is not completely uncommon in criticism, especially criticism meant for the general public, to hold the artist producing the work accountable, but rarely does the review expand to the point where the review becomes as much a referendum on the artist as it does the artist's work. What makes both critics even more interesting is the complete abandonment of any semblance of objectivity. In Cooper's Literary Offenses, Twain merely implies a personal attack in the second paragraph, stating Cooper's art has some defects, and makes his hint louder when he states less than a full page of Cooper's Deerslayer scores a 114 out of a possible 115 errors. It breaks the record. Later, Mark Twain makes it clear that Cooper's failure as an artist is not limited to one single work, though he does single out Deerslayer. Instead, he reveals Cooper to be a shoddy craftsman and storyteller who wrote about the poorest English that exists in our language, and that the English of the Deerslayer is the very worst that even Cooper ever wrote. In the introduction to the review of Star Wars Episode II, Attack of the Clones, Plinkett calls the film the worst thing ever made. He follows by posing a disingenuous question meant to allow his audience the benefit of disagreement, but then undercutting the audience's choice by the phrasing of the question and then providing an answer for it. Plinkett asks, so, do the prequels basically expose Lucas as being a shallow, emotionless businessman? I'll let you decide. But the answer is yes, completely cutting off any ability of the audience to arrive at their own conclusions. So the noteworthy aspects of both of these reviews is that they not only criticize and satirize and in many ways parody the text itself, but again, the reviews become as much about the artist that produces the art as the art itself. That Mark Twain's Cooper's Literary Offenses becomes about Cooper's failings, not just one work's problems. The prequel reviews by Plinkett become a referendum on Lucas as a valued artist, basically arguing that the prequels undercut any kind of success that Lucas had in his previous career. In any kind of criticism, an ideal is at the very least implied. While both reviews rely on humor as a vehicle for criticism, they also reveal an alternative artistic ideal in response to their target's failings. Critics such as Tom Hazuka and J. Leslie Dameron have written essays on elements that have shaped Mark Twain's artistic ideal. For example, Dameron argues that Twain's rules on language may have been inspired by an 18th century work by Hugh Blair called Lectures on Rhetoric and Belles Lettres. Mark Twain's emphasis on craftsmanship, word choice, and storytelling is evident also in Twain's fiction. The best example of Twain's explanation of his artistic ideal, apart from Cooper's Literary Offenses, occurs in A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, in which Hank Morgan provides suggestions for Sandy's very inefficient method for telling stories. And Sandy's stories have many of the same hallmarks as romantic fiction. Mark Twain wrote a follow-up to Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses called Fenimore Cooper's Further Literary Offenses. And though this work was unpublished in Twain's lifetime, it offers a more specific glimpse of Twain's vision by showing suggested revisions of Cooper's sentences. He also offers the following explanation of Cooper's style that suggests Twain's own vision of a writer's responsibility. Twain writes, "Style may be likened to an army, the author to its general, the book to its campaign. Some authors proportion an attacking force to the strength or weakness, the importance or unimportance of the object to be attacked, but Cooper doesn't. It doesn't make any difference to Cooper whether the object of attack is 100,000 men or a cow. He hurls his entire force against it." This metaphor that Twain constructs emphasizes his vision of precision and restraint in an author's work, And Cooper's main problem is his lack of restraint, that he sends his whole army after an object of description, whether that is an opposing army or whether it's a cow. And what's noteworthy about this in Plinkett's criticisms of Lucas's work is his criticism of Lucas's fascination with computer-generated technology. That so much to the point where Lucas wants to fill the image with a dense array of images. As a matter of fact, one of the continued behind-the-scenes clips that Plinkett uses to illustrate the obsession with computer-generated graphics in these movies is producer Rick McCallum saying that the frame is so dense, right? It's so packed. And McCallum is saying this as a good thing, right? That the frame is packed with so much computer-generated imagery that they fail to recognize that, much like Cooper is throwing all of his weapons at a cow, so too are Lucas and the producers of these movies throwing all of their use of computer-generated imagery onto an image. Right? So one could argue that this metaphor is also apt for Lucas's over-reliance on special effects in the Star Wars prequels. As noted in a section called The Language of Cinema, Plinkett argues that Lucas uses CGI as a crutch to tell his story, instead of relying on a collaborative effort including producers, set designers, and actors. In another review, Plinkett emphasizes the idea of art from adversity to produce a more relatable work of art. Throughout the prequel reviews, Plinkett also suggests a less is more approach, which emphasizes story over spectacle in contemporary movies. While Plinkett acknowledges that big budget movies are ultimately a money-making endeavor, he also argues that movies should use creative visuals, practical effects with live sets, and clear character motivation to inspire audiences. So the result of all of this is that not only are Twain and Plinkett offering criticisms and offering humor, but they're also offering a way to make, in Twain's estimation, to make novels better, right? To make novels better, you don't write like Cooper. And for Plinkett, who voices the criticisms of Mike Stoklasa, that you make movies better not by cramming more computer-generated effects, not by cramming more spectacle in, but by cramming more character development in, by having plots that make sense, by using practical sets that advocate for a less is more approach. That these are the ways that art can connect with people. So finally, even though there is a great amount of criticism and a great amount of humor that can be taken from both Mark Twain's and Plinkett's reviews, there is also an embedded idealism in the criticism that they level at Cooper and Lucas in these reviews. I have already discussed Mark Twain's efforts to undermine the pedantic nature of literary scholarship in Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses, but I would like to briefly revisit it as I begin to conclude my lecture. Much like his comments on music in A Tramp Abroad, Twain suggests that critics, especially academic critics, tend to divorce their laudatory efforts from an actual reading of the text and an enjoyment of the text. So when Brander Matthews, in praise of Cooper, asserts that the craft of the woodsman, the tricks of the trapper, all the delicate art of the forest were familiar to Cooper from his youth up, Twain cannot help but see that sentence as empty praise that is not borne out in the actual text of Cooper, because what Twain sees is a repetition of those stage properties that Matthews sees as the delicate art of the forest. Twain sees as a repetition of the same tricks over and over, right? That there's no real ingenuity. So this ultimate praise from Matthews ends up hollow. So by exaggerating how horrible Cooper's writing is, Mark Twain is course correcting the excessive praise offered by critics like Brander Matthews and Lounsbury. So what he's essentially doing is throwing tomatoes at Cooper while making Matthews and Lounsbury pay admission to see it. Bruce Michelson uses the analogy of helium and hot gas to describe the process by which academics lose track of evaluating an artist's work because we spend so much time bloviating about their greatness. And Michelson writes, our forebears Matthews and Lounsbury, on upholstered seats of cultured authority, were obliging pumping hot gas out. In Cooper's literary offenses, Twain undermines the whole endeavor and largely succeeds in his efforts both in the short and long term. So in the short term, his essay is discussed and it's read. And in the long term, many people still account for Twain's criticisms of Cooper when doing Cooper scholarship. And also the long-term success of it has been influential on humorous criticism that follows it. And YouTube critics themselves are the long-term, or the result of this long-term success that Twain establishes in his critique of Cooper. Red Letter Media is a beneficiary of Mark Twain's anti-critical attack on Cooper and the academics who praise Cooper. So as such, their trick in anti-criticism is much more difficult. After all, Mark Twain's world, there was a clear literary elite that attempted to guide interpretations of literature for the reading public. In the world that Red Letter Media is publishing their reviews in, there is not such a clear divide. In fact, someone else can post their own review of Red Letter Media, and people indeed have posted their own reviews of Red Letter Media's critiques of the Star Wars prequels. So there are no more gatekeepers, right? So the gate has been crashed down. So this anti-critical pose is much trickier in the Plinkett Reviews than what Mark Twain must do. So what Red Letter Media does to distinguish itself as anti-critical is in two ways. In the Force Awakens review, in the segment that I asked you to watch earlier, Plinkett points out the various other YouTube channels and acknowledges that the market is flooded, right? That YouTube is flooded with people who complain about movies. And so what Plinkett does is focuses on one particular work of criticism called the Star Wars ring theory, and uses that as an example of the over-intellectualization of the Star Wars prequels by these critics who apply pedantic analysis to justify terrible movies. So Plinkett proceeds to completely undermine this ring theory and its academic bloviating and pretensions to show that it's really just the use of a bunch of big words in order to make movies that are bad seem better than what they are. And the second strategy that Plinkett, that is used in the Plinkett Reviews, is the blunting of his own critical analysis through mispronouncing literary terms and actors' names. And Benjamin Kerbach asserts that this strategy serves as a kind of populist gesture, a prophylactic against pedanticism. It is in this that both Mark Twain and Red Letter Media at one time advocate for their own interpretation of a literary work by first undermining academic credibility. But rather than claim credibility for themselves, they use gestures that connect them with regular readers and audiences. As I conclude, I should note that ultimately criticism is a subjective endeavor rife with complexity when attempting to arrive at a truth on which everyone can agree. As much as people agree with Twain's or Plinkett's reviews, there are those who disagree. Twain and Plinkett are noteworthy examples of humorous criticism, not necessarily because they are right, but because both address different concerns in the context of American art. Twain is attacking weak romanticism in Cooper, while Plinkett is attacking the crass commercialization in contemporary cinema, with George Lucas's Star Wars prequels as a prime example. Nevertheless, they use similar tools to critique what they perceive as a weakness in the evaluation of art in American culture. Turning to a comic mask only partially hides the contempt with which they view shoddy artists and the critics who praise them. Both advocate for a clear plot with characters that have clear motivation and are relatable while committing to craftsmanship and language. Certainly, other critics may disagree with their analysis and conclusions, but what cannot be denied is the elevation of humorous criticism into an art form in of itself that holds artists, audience, and critics accountable for their choices. Thank you very much for your time. And please, what I miss most about this online format is the ability to field questions and have conversations about this and get recommendations on how I can improve this research. This project is intended to be a book-length project, and I'm still very early in the process. So if any of you watching have any suggestions on things I should read, both critics who use consistently humorous strategy to criticize work, if there is a book that I've missed or that you think I should read, please email me at this email address, or email me to get my phone number. I don't want to put my phone number on YouTube, but email me to get my phone number and let's have a chat. I miss so much the ability to have a question and answer session in the context of these kinds of lectures. So please, if you would like to talk, ask a question, complain, please feel free to contact me. And thank you all so much for your time. And I want to again thank the Center for Mark Twain Studies for this tremendous opportunity. Many thanks.